Hello, everyone. Happy Constitution Day. I'm Yuval. I'm Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's AEI Walter Berns Constitution Day Lecture. This is our 10th annual Constitution Day Lecture, and these lectures are named for one of the giants of American constitutional scholarship who made his home at AEI for many years, the late Walter Berns. Walter was a scholar of the American political tradition whose work was enormously important to the development of constitutional thought over the past half century and more. He helped us to make sense of debates about the meaning of the Bill of Rights, to understand the character of American patriotism. He was key to the development of some of the ideas that would come to be understood as originalism, to deepening our understanding of the work of the framers, and to shaping generations of scholars in these areas. So before the lecture, we wanted to start with a brief video about Walter and his work, to recall that great teacher and colleague, and to put us all in the right frame of mind to talk about the Constitution and its meaning together. Let's watch that quickly, and then we'll turn to our lecture.
Walter Berns was once a scholar and a patriot. And that, unfortunately, in the contemporary world and in contemporary America, is kind of rare.
Patriotism is not natural, but has to be taught or somehow acquired. And the question was then, and I suppose still is, how was this new patriotism to be taught or somehow acquired by later generations of citizens?
On the one hand, he loved the country, thought people had to be encouraged to love it for reasons that had been stated by Walter's great hero, Abraham Lincoln, especially in a free country. It can't be taken for granted that people will simply love the country and do the things that are needed to protect it.
This was not simply the rah-rah patriotism of a war hero, which he was.
Walter was a veteran of World War II. He had served from the absolute beginning in the Navy. He had seen action. I used to like to tell my children he had taken North Africa single-handedly, when they were still young enough to believe that. And so he had a very powerful sense of what the country had been through. And Walter in particular had a sort of odyssey after World War II. But eventually they pitched up in Taos, New Mexico, where a writer's artist colony had been founded.
He was going to be the, great American novelist, but then eventually he burned the manuscript. I just decided that wasn't him and wound up going to the University of Chicago. And someone told him, you have to take a course with this fellow, Leo Strauss. And Walter said, I said, I'll do it next semester. And finally he did.
He was very greatly influenced by Leo Strauss, and Leo Strauss said, we should go back and read Aristotle. We should go back and read old books because we can still learn things from old books. And it's not enough to say, I don't completely agree. All right, you don't completely agree. What is it you think is right? And if you start by saying, well, no one is right, or there is no right, you're just going to go through life chortling and chuckling and being frivolous and silly, and that isn't the life Walter Berns was going to lead.
Walter believed that true patriotism for an American includes an appreciation of self-criticism.
We are not expected to love our country simply because it is our country. Love can be blind, and love of country, like love of wife or husband or lover, can be blind too. But ours is not supposed to be a blind patriotism.
But he always insisted that our criticism of the Constitution be fully informed, that criticism had to be based upon a full understanding. And it was that fuller understanding that he spent a good deal of his life in reviving.
Walter Berns was one of a very small group of scholars who made the founding relevant again and really fundamental to our understanding of ourselves. We take it for granted now that, well, of course, if you study America, you have to read the Federalist Papers and you have to think about the Constitution and the Constitutional Convention and John Marshall, not just the latest Supreme Court cases, and you have to read Lincoln. That was not the case when Walter Berns began writing on these topics in the 1950s and into the 1960s. And he and a small group of friends and colleagues of his really revived the study of the founders, showed why you couldn't understand America without understanding the founders.
I think part of what happened to Walter and to a lot of other people is that the left changed out from under them and came to really reject the vision of the Constitution. To be a partisan of the Constitution, which is, if Walter was any kind of partisan, I think that was his party, by late in his life meant that he was a conservative by default, but I don't think he was a conservative in the way that the conservative movement understands that term. I can see how Walter would be uncomfortable with the term, and a lot of people of his generation were, but the fact is he and they transformed conservatism in a way that made it more like them. I think what today's young conservatives mean by thinking of Walter as a conservative is purely a compliment. It means that they see themselves shaped by his teachings.
Walter Berns was at AEI when I came here in 1986, and he was here for all of my tenure as president, up until his 90th birthday. He was in the office every day, right up to the end. He was the complete intellectual and the archetype of what AEI has always tried to promote and insinuate into larger political debate.
When Lincoln was a young man, he gave a speech about the Founding Fathers in which he called them a forest of giant oaks. I thought Walter very much represented that image. These were people in the founding whom Lincoln felt had greater challenges than his own generation. Walter Berns was one of the giant oaks Lincoln spoke about, and he's left an extraordinary legacy for those of us who are still here at AEI, his scholarship and his great strengths as a colleague and friend to many here.
It's a great honor for us to remember Walter today, just as he would have liked to be remembered, I think, which is by coming together to think about the Constitution. And we could hardly ask for a better guide in doing that than our speaker today, Wilfred McClay. Professor McClay is a professor of history at Hillsdale College and a widely renowned scholar of American history. Among his many books are The Masterless, Self and Society in Modern America, Figures in the Carpet, Finding the Human Person in the American Past, and the extraordinary book, kind of textbook of American history, Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story. McClay served on the National Council of the Humanities, the advisory board of the National Endowment for the Humanities, for more than a decade. He is a member of the Semi-Quincentennial Commission, which has been charged with figuring out how to celebrate the nation's 250th birthday in 5 years. For generations of students, Bill McClay has been just a model of what it is to teach the history of our country in a way that helps us to see it in full. He's a graduate of St. John's College in Annapolis, received his PhD in history from Johns Hopkins. His lecture today is entitled The Constitution in American Civic Education. And it's a particularly appropriate subject because this year also marks the 20th anniversary of Walter Berns's great book, Making Patriots, which was devoted to the question of how to form the rising generation into American citizens, how to teach the love of country, which is no small challenge. After his remarks, Professor McClay will take questions from all of you, moderated by Gary Schmidt of AI. You can submit a question in one of two ways: by emailing Nicole Penn at nicole.penn, PNN, at ai.org, or God help us on Twitter with the hashtag Constitution Day AEI. And with that, Bill, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yuval. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it's daunting to have to follow Walter Berns, who one of the things about Walter that we all know of us who knew him, is sort of left out of that video, is how crusty he could be, how little patience he had for foolishness. I guess that's hinted at. So I'd like to think that he's going to approve of my remarks if he's auditing them. I imagine he has better things to do. So anyway, it's wonderful to travel in his wake for this day, and it was wonderful too to see in the video many friends who some of whom are no longer with us. Robert Goldwyn, who was the dean of St. John's when I was a student there, Carlin Bowman, who really runs things at AAI, as everybody knows. Wonderful to see her still going strong as ever, which means the ship of AAI is going strong. But let me begin. I'm not going to begin by talking about the Constitution. I'm going to come at that obliquely. I want to begin by talking about the British royal family. Queen Elizabeth II, is now the longest reigning monarch in British history, having eclipsed Victoria's formidable 63-year record, and is continuing to add to her record numbers with each passing year, as of now in the late summer, early fall of 2021. Her achievement has been celebrated in the American news media, partly because we Americans seem to love her. And we have an enduring fascination with the British royal family in all of its peculiarities. Just why is that? Why is that the fondness for Elizabeth in particular? It seems rather strange for a country that came into being through a revolution against one of Elizabeth's predecessors. Not to mention being a country whose constitution, the 235th anniversary of which is what we are celebrating today, incorporated in itself the principle that no title of nobility would be granted by the United States, and that every state in the Union was to have a republican form of government with a small r, meaning no kings and queens allowed. There are probably a lot of elements to this puzzle that more than I have time for, space for, but surely part of the answer to my question, why this fondness, lies in the durable bonds between our two nations and the form of shared language, customs, laws, culture, political culture. Our country may have been born in rebellion, but our Constitution's form and contents are deeply indebted to British precedents and influences that shaped it, especially following the long and often bloody struggles for power in the 17th century, culminating in the Glorious Revolution. More generally, the special relationship between our two nations has proven deep and enduring, despite our occasional differences, and we're having one of them at the moment. There can be no doubt about it. We Americans have a rooting interest in the well-being of the Queen. But there's something else at work too. The Queen's most important role in her country is as an impersonal figure. Her office as a disinterested one, a transpartisan symbol of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth. Elizabeth performs that role with superlative grace. She's arguably the single most compelling symbol of political stability and unity in the world today. Despite all the changes and fissures that have afflicted British society in the years since her reign began in 1952, including a radical transformation of the nation's international status and of its demographic makeup, not to mention the endless foibles of the royal family, which we won't say anything more about. Her matronly but commanding presence reassures her people and those of us who care about them, which is most of us, that the essential things will carry on year after year. Whether that essential British core will survive the British nation's loss of her is anyone's guess, but I think the odds are high. The monarchy she sought to preserve will endure as long as a reasonably coherent British nation does. And there's something enviable in that. We Americans often feel the absence of such unifying symbols in our own contentious nation, and many of us yearn for them, especially at the present moment when so much in our national life seems fiercely contested, and the presidency itself, no matter who occupies that office, seems more often to be an avenue of division than a symbol of a binding unity. Lacking the symbols of unity, we fear, understandably, we may be losing the thing itself. It's not an unjustifiable fear. But in fact, we do not lack for unifying symbols if we're willing to avail ourselves of them. Ever since George Washington gallantly refused the office of monarch, we have had a different path, a path on which our commitment to impersonal laws and impartial procedures overrides our commitments to any one man or woman as our symbolic head. For us, it is a document, our Constitution, that plays the role of democratic monarch for us, and thereby serves as the chief and most durable symbol of our national unity and our commitment to one another as one nation. This is not all the Constitution does, of course. It is first and foremost a legal document, a written expression of the supreme law of the land, establishing the fundamental structure of our national government, delineating the relationship to the states, explicitly providing certain individual and collective rights over against the power of the national government. As such, it's not in any obvious way an equivalent to a monarch. And like most legal documents, it's actually a rather dry affair, unlike the Declaration of Independence, for example, which has soaring language. And the Constitution, aside from the preamble, has no stirring language proclaiming the sweeping idealism of its claims. That's part of its genius. But its symbolic function is an absolutely crucial part of what it is for us. We have lived under its authority for the entire span of our nation's history, apart from a brief prelude under the Articles of Confederation. Hence, our national identity is difficult to conceive apart from it. To do so would mean entry into utterly uncharted waters. By contrast, the French have had, through the centuries, they've cycled through a multitude of regimes, monarchies, republics, empires, and yet French identity has never been reliant for its existence on any particular form of government. We think of the United States as a young country, and perhaps we're right to do so, but the established life of the American nation has not existed apart from its Constitution, which happens to be the world's oldest Constitution. Hence, it's especially proper at a time of such intense contention in our national life that we pause to remember it and reflect on it. And I would add to express our reverence for it. That, of course, doesn't mean the Constitution and its longevity has always been a cause for celebration. There have always been detractors from the very beginning, impatient with the impediments built into the constitutional structure. One of our most distinguished founders, Thomas Jefferson, was often dismissive of the Constitution's enduring importance. He mocked those who, quote, look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence, as I just did a moment ago, and deem them like the Ark of the Covenant, which I did not do. and Jefferson continued, ascribe to the men of the preceding age a wisdom more than human. Now, Jefferson wasn't entirely wrong in this attitude. The Constitution should never be treated as holy writ, complete and unalterable. The framers never intended that it should be so regarded. But Jefferson was wrong to disparage our instinct to venerate the Constitution. And the fact that we have changed it in so many ways since his time, sometimes improving it, sometimes battering it, sometimes elaborating on it, sometimes deviating from it, none of that changes matters. We need our sprightly 234-year-old Constitution now more than ever. We need it primarily as a foundational charter of our liberties, our organizational plan for limited government. But we also need it as an anchor for our national life, a focal point of legitimacy in times of conflict, an educative instrument that demonstrates to those under its sway the kinds of restraints that are required of a free people living under the rule of law, the ways that the wants and desires of free citizens can be directed to make possible a good, orderly society. It's striking how often in times of crisis, our national debates end up devolving into rival interpretations of what the Constitution says. Many examples of this could be adduced. I remember during the Clinton impeachment, even those who were proponents of the president's side of the matter were constantly referring to the Constitution. Maybe the first time they'd ever done so, but it shows the power of the Constitution's legitimating force. As such, the Constitution must stand at the center of any civic education worthy of the name, as a model whose example is felt in all the activities of American citizenship. It's admittedly far less charming and personable than Queen Elizabeth, and it lends itself poorly to occasions of pomp and ceremony. But it's proved far more durable than any queen or king, and its health is the key to our continued unity and prosperity as a people. Civic education should serve as a function of unlocking the secrets behind that document's power. Learn about the complex structure of our federal government, our state governments, the relationship between them, to understand the elaborate system of checks and balances that thwarts the natural tendency towards concentration of power. This need not be an exercise in dry rote memorization. Understood rightly, it's nothing less than a profound reflection on human nature, just as James Madison famously said that it was in Federalist 51. It conveys the hard truth that given the flawed timber of human nature, a free and good society will also be a contentious society. Sorry about that. In which interests inevitably collide with other interests, in which lawful rules of engagement for the adjustment and adjudication of conflict and the institutions that embody them are absolutely necessary. Not everyone agrees. One of the arguments commonly adduced against the Constitution, its centrality of the Constitution in civic education, is the fact of the social pluralism of today's American society. This view, an 18th century document designed for the government of a largely agrarian and homogeneous nation, could not possibly be adequate to the far more complex society we live in now. What can the Constitution tell us about how to deal with issues like internet hacking, identity theft, the rights of surrogate parents, or more generally, how does the study of the Constitution help us think about problems of which the framers could not possibly have dreamed? The argument can be extended further. Perhaps the very idea that there's a unified American identity is itself a delusion. Maybe it always has been. Maybe we're just too diverse today to think of ourselves in that way any longer. If so, the civic education should not concern itself with inculcating and reinforcing a national commonality that no longer exists. Instead, it should concern itself with the empowerment of sub-communities and marginalized groups as a means of expanding the reach of a more truly democratic ethos, a more perfect union, in the language of the preamble. Teaching the citizenry about theories and structures of government is a waste of time in this view, as Peter Levine and other political theorists argue, people who are very interested in civic education. The essence of citizenship is activity. The citizen is the person who asks the question, what should we do? And who then mobilizes to do it. But this argument presumes a great deal. It presumes in the first place that nothing is to be gained from referring present day technological and ethnic puzzles back to older constitutional principles and categories. But that's certainly not true. If anything, such referring backwards can be a source of illumination, precisely because it forces the reconsideration of particulars within the context of larger abstractions. Questions of internet security are clarified by reference to the Fourth Amendment. Issues of big tech, they're not resolved necessarily, but they're clarified. Issues of big tech censorship are usefully developed by asking whether or not Google and Facebook and Twitter and the rest are common carriers in the common law sense of the term. We're forced to reconsider present day instances in light of more enduring, even perennial features of human relations. The argument also presupposes there's a sufficient cultural homogeneity in present-day America to achieve meaningful consensus about what it means to say something should be done, Peter Levine's words, and how one acts lawfully in doing it. But Levine errs, I think, in saying the question of what should be done is an empirical one, which he says. Should is never an empirical term. It necessarily implies the introduction of some set of values, some moral framework, some conception of the good that guides the course of human actions. The art of deliberation, too, is impossible without a whole set of prior commitments to principles of integrity, rationality, and mutuality that do not arise spontaneously in human beings, alas, but require education in just the way Walter Berns was talking about, in shared values that are inculcated well in advance of the act of deliberating. The pragmatic premises of what's called action civics, which Peter Levine advocates for, are different. They presume that civic education is kinetic, that one learns to deliberate by the act of deliberation, learns to make political judgments by making political judgments. Well, this is not entirely wrong. The example of jury service, which I think many of you watching this will have experienced with extraordinary effect of service on a jury. It's a powerful example. It would be even more powerful if it applied not only to adults, but to school-age children. But one cannot deliberate or judge until one's come into possession of the moral tools to do so. Knowledge independently arrived at, the ability to make dispassionate decisions and judgments. Otherwise, one will simply be engaged in political action based entirely on what others tell one that he or she should be doing. When high school students are urged to participate in public demonstrations on behalf of complex issues, climate change, open borders, tax policy, or is in my former hometown of Norman, Oklahoma, the proper role of the police and size of the police, issues about which they cannot possibly have made an independent and informed judgment. That is exactly what's happening. High school students are participating in public affairs on the basis of what others tell them to do. And this is a mockery of civic education. They're being exploited rather than educated. The question of cultural diversity, too, can lead in a very different direction than the exponents of the new civics would take it. As Samuel Goldman argues in his very interesting and engaging new book, After Nationalism, subtitle Being American in an Age of Division, he argues that there's obstacles to the revival of national identity that are insuperable. And we might as well get used to the idea of strengthening our institutions of contestation. That is his term, institutions of contestation. Foremost of which, of course, is the Constitution itself. I mean, the Constitution is nothing if not an institution of contestation. And the court systems and other such juridical bodies, rather than chasing the phantom of a more cohesive culture. In other words, give the people sparring rings to fight out their differences rather than try to iron out these differences through civic education. Well, I'm not sure I buy every element of this analysis, since it seems clear to me that the embrace of constitutionalism itself is a value commitment, a term Walter Berns would have not approved of, so forgive me, Walter. A moral commitment, we'll say, a commitment to the idea that what we should be doing has to be pursued in conformity with the higher law, the established higher law, previously established legal and constitutional norms and commitments, which include respect for people who think we should be doing something else or think we should leave them alone. But Goldman makes an important point that a firm commitment to respect institutional procedures of contestation, such as rules of evidence, right to counsel, without insisting in advance on particular substantive outcomes, could be a minimal but essential basis for holding a highly pluralistic society together. But how minimal? How much is enough? How can such unquestioned respect for our procedures be maintained unless the Constitution is itself something to be venerated, something that brings respect to the government and contributes to its stability and endurance, and that provides a bond that connects the people to the nation? This is where my Queen Elizabeth analogy comes in. The Constitution's framers seemed inclined to agree with this. Consider these words of James Madison from Federalist 25. Wise politicians know that every breach of the fundamental laws, though dictated by necessity, impairs that sacred reverence which ought to be maintained in the breasts of rulers toward the Constitution of a country, and forms a precedent for other breaches where the same plea of necessity does not exist at all or is less urgent or palpable. Wow, he could have been talking about our times with that statement. And in many ways, it's echoed in Lincoln's famous Lyceum address, 50-some years later. If Madison's right, the dignity of the law should be understood as a seamless web for which an unattended tear, broken window, so to speak, especially in the area of the highest and most general law, can present a more general loss of confidence in the law's efficacy and worthiness. A loss of reverence for the highest law in the land cannot help but undermine the way law and lawful behavior are understood on subordinate levels. It would undermine the efficacy and authority of these institutions of contestation, to use Sam Goldman's term. But I don't think we should be ready to accede to such a thin understanding of what it means to be an American citizen. It's unfortunate that the word citizenship has lost much of the noble luster it once had, just as civics has wound up being demoted to a kind of user's guide to the machinery of government. Both words deserve better, and I think we all should welcome some of the rethinking of civics and civic education that's going on. Citizenship is not merely about voting. Ultimately, it's about membership in a society of civic equals, citizens, not subjects, whose respect for one another's equal standing under the law and whose commitment to the participation in the commonweal is a guiding moral premise of our way of life. So civic education extends far beyond the mechanics of how a bill becomes a law. Ultimately, and it is wildly unfashionable of me to say this, but I will anyway, a civic education is an education in love. The love in question, as Walter Berns said, is a peculiar kind of love. It's not romantic love. It's not erotic love. It's not familial love, or any other kind of love, really. And we need to find ways to teach it. It doesn't come osmotically, automatically. It can't be imposed by teachers or schools or government edicts. Even by reading Walter's book, Making Patriots won't do it, especially in a free country, as he pointed out. It must be embraced freely, be strong and mature enough to coexist with elements of the self-critical, of disappointment, of shame, opposition, dissent, all of these things that come with moral maturity and with a knowledge of the complexity of the historical record. But it is love all the same. Love can coexist perfectly well with a critical acknowledgement of faults and imperfections. It's one of the reasons that I'm still married, is that I married somebody who could tolerate that kind of discrepancy. We see this every day, this quality of love in many of our most important relationships with others. The highest love is not blind, exactly as Walter said. But without encouraging the development of love for the nation, there will be less and less willingness on the part of citizens to make sacrifices for the invisible and anonymous others making up the nation, whether made on the field of battle or in the equitable provision of healthcare or welfare policy, or any number of other things. We can already see the development of an idea of government as an entitlement mechanism, which is a sort of vending machine of benefits, dispenser of funds. Without the deeper foundation of love, memory, membership, a people's sacrificial capacity taps out very soon and the republic perishes. Let me give an example of what a richer consciousness of the past and civic education history should be an essential part of civic education. A richer consciousness of the past and the Constitution's centrality to it can provide us. And wonder of wonders, I didn't know we were going to have Walter Berns introducing my talk. It concerns Abraham Lincoln, a great American leader who had an enormously powerful sense of connection to the past, and I think deserves to be emulated in that respect alone, if not all the other respects in which he's emulative, deserves emulation. According to James McPherson, whose testimony on this I completely trust, Lincoln didn't read any history as a young man. We know he read voraciously, he read Shakespeare, he read the King James Bible, Blackstone, all kinds of stuff, but didn't read history, with one exception. We know he read Parson Weems's 1799 biography of George Washington, which is the book that gives the fable of the cherry tree and is not generally seen. In fact, when I was in graduate school, it was always held up as the example of what one didn't do as a historian. Yet Lincoln loved the book, it seemed to have memorized it. And we know this because he said so. In 1861, February of 1861, he gave a speech at the New Jersey State Senate. He was on his way from Springfield to Washington for his inauguration. Very tense time. The southern states are falling away one after another. There's a real sense in the air that the nation might be doomed to disintegrate. So Trenton, stopped off in Trenton, New Jersey, on his way to Washington, and gave a short but powerful speech to the Senate, in which he recalled the effect of Weems's book on him. Now, Lincoln was a great politician, among other things. And so, of course, he was in Trenton. Why not speak to the world historical significance of Trenton? All of you who've ridden the train through Trenton know they have that bridge that says, "Trenton makes, the world takes." So it's not a bad political gambit to appeal to that. But nevertheless, Lincoln goes on to say something I think is true. He says, "I remember," he said in this speech, "I remember this battle, which was a pivotal battle of the American Revolution." That's not an exaggeration at all. "I remember reading about this in Weems. I remember the battlefields. I remember," let me start quoting from Lincoln, "the struggles for the liberties of the country, the crossing of the river, the contest with the Hessians, the hardships endured at the time, all fixed themselves on my very youthful memory, more than any single revolutionary event. And you all know, for you all have been boys," he says, you could say children, you all have been children. "You all know how these early impressions last longer than others. I recollect thinking then, boy though I was, there must have been something more than common that these men struggled for." Not something more than common, he said, something more than national independence, something that held out great promise to the people of the world in the time to come. And he said, I was exceedingly anxious. I am exceedingly anxious that this union, this Constitution, shall be perpetuated in accordance with the original idea for which the struggle was made. So all of this he hangs on or suspends from a youthful story. That's a lot for a story to do. It filled a boy's mind and soul in ways that would have enormous consequences for the man and for the rest of us. It helped him form a compelling vision of the American past and of the role of the generation of 76, the founding of the nation, the establishment of the Constitution, at the center of that vision, as they so often were in Lincoln's oratory. So what do we conclude from this example? Obviously, the one thing we don't conclude is that historians should write fables favorable to the founding fathers rather than engage in careful methodical research. What Walter said about self-criticism is extremely important. That's an element in our patriotism, is our ability to love our founders and see their faults, just as I pointed out that Lincoln was being a good politician in praising Trenton while speaking in Trenton. Nothing wrong with that. We don't do the young any favors by fritifying or oversimplifying the past, failing to give an honest account of our failures as well as our triumphs. But we also do no favors to ourselves or the truth if we fail to honor the magnificent achievements of our history and leave them out of the accounting entirely, has more and more recently become the case. We need to remember that one of the chief civic functions of history, one of the chief reasons we endeavor to record the past and teach it to the young, is as a vessel of shared memory, imparting to each generation that sense of membership in one's own society, of connection to that past, something that can unite us and sustain us in hard times. Lincoln brought to that very connection many of his best wartime speeches, notably his speech at Gettysburg, which he began, of course, by referring to the past, by drawing on the past 77 years ago. One of the great achievements in human history occurred, a precious legacy to whose preservation the deeds of the present should be dedicated. And for Lincoln, that was preeminently the Constitution, preservation of the Constitution. He found in the American founding a source of renewal, determination, a steadying influence, an object of reverence. So can it be for us today, and our young people deserve nothing less. We have been failing them and failing our country by failing to give them a rich and sustaining sense of that past, something truthful and inspiring, both things. And consider the alternative, which I think is what we are experiencing. If the story of estimable things gives us courage, as it did Lincoln, and hope in a hard time, does it not stand to reason that a story of relentless failure, mendacity, despoliation can have the opposite effect? This is what I call the Inglorious Story of American history. And it too is a kind of civic education, even if we don't think about it that way. We're so solicitous of the safety of students who may be exposed to ideas and words that they find upsetting. But why don't we think about the effects of the Inglorious Story, the inglorious version of America that they're taking in with their reading of Howard Zinn and the 1619 Project and these kinds of things? Shouldn't we consider whether the remarkably high indicators of unhappiness among the young, and not only them, are partly traceable to a massive loss of morale and hope? Suicides among young Americans aged 10 to 24 increased by nearly 60% between 2007 and 2018. And no doubt when we have the statistics running through the pandemic, that number is going to jump. Many such statistics, I won't go on about them. I think that one statistic makes a powerful point. And these statistics concern me deeply, as I think they do any sensible person. It's hard not to see them as presaging a sort of moral collapse in that generation. no one would deny the material factors involved, changes in the economy and so on and so forth. But the morale of a nation is ultimately a question of its spirit rather than matter. By moving into the vacuum left by the absence of a genuine civic education that's grounded in our most venerable and central document that gives shape to our political life, along with other things, the decline of traditional religion, the decline of the family structure, it's a long list of things. The Inglorious Story has been gaining the upper hand, playing a significant role in sustaining our low morale, saturating the young in debilitating ideas about the past, present, and future, leaving them isolated and anxious. So these matters take us much further than mere civics, although mere civics is never mere. Properly understood, civics involves us in a consideration of human nature itself and what the best set of arrangements are to cope with human nature as we find it. And it teaches us about our indebtedness to the past. It seeks to instill in us a sense of continuity with generations gone before. And doing so begins the process of locating one's life in a meaning larger than oneself. An approach to civics is relentlessly pragmatic and present-minded and fails to draw upon our treasury of unifying symbols, notably that of the Constitution, to circle back to my beginning. That approach is going to fail to engender these things and will only serve to reinforce the short-sightedness and self-absorption that are such a conspicuous feature of our times. Let's not do that. Thank you all.
Bill, that was wonderful. Thank you. Really, really, really quite stunning. If you don't mind, I'd like to be able to ask you a few follow-up questions based upon your remarks, and then we'll leave some time for questions from folks who are tuning in. I'll go back to the beginning of your talk. I think the line was, our Constitution plays the role of the democratic monarch for us. Quite striking, analogy. But I was also thinking, I was also wondering, I mean, one of the things that is different between, Queen Elizabeth and our Constitution is she gets to say things. In other words, she may not talk much, but there's those occasions when she does make remarks. Whereas the Constitution is kind of left for others to talk about it. And I think I'll let you sort of, think or talk about this a little bit more. But one of the things that struck me by that reference is, when you think about it, it's largely the lawyers and the judges who tell us what the Constitution is about, which is a fairly narrow way of thinking about the constitutional order. And I wonder if that's one of the reasons for current appreciation for that civic character of the Constitution that you spoke so eloquently about.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think especially the last part of it, the sort of over-lawyering, shall we say, of our sense of our founding document, and that ideally in a Republican form of government, the laws should not be opaque. They should not require the interventions of experts or priests of the law to enable us to know how to rule ourselves. I think that's a real problem. It's a problem with a written constitution. It's a problem with an unwritten constitution. We sort of have both in effect. But I wanted to say your first part. I mean, I agree with that, and I'm not sure what the solution is. But the first part about how Queen Elizabeth can speak and shows remarkable, I mean, through all kinds of vicissitudes, some of which we've lived through lately or tried tried not to live through in my case, tried not to pay any attention to, but she does have to say, sometimes she has to say something. Sometimes she has the wisdom to say nothing or to say as little as possible. And that's part of the art of knowing your office. I'm sure a lot of you watched the series The Crown. I watched the first season of it and then I stopped because I knew it was going to turn into melodrama as it did. But that's a wonderful illustration of what it means, and to see that character take on the office of queen, of monarch, and that required her to abridge herself of all kinds of human passions and reactions that would be normal for any person. But back to the American instance of the Constitution, I think this is why what Walter Berns and others have done in bringing about the movement we call imprecisely originalism is so important, because if you allow the Constitution to simply become the plaything of whatever group of people happen to have the megaphone or the microphone at any given time, then it's not an instrument of self-government anymore. And the movement we call originalism is an effort to kind of give a voice back to the Constitution, different than what's sort of going on right now, and to sort of say what originally, or what can we deduce from the text. And I know I'm smoothing over a lot of differences here, but it is it is that it's one of the reasons I think the study of history is so important, because I think it actually gives us a way of freeing ourselves from the prison house, the cognitive prison house of the present. We can go back and see what did the framers, what to the nearest we can tell, what do they mean by the First Amendment, Second Amendment, and it does involve the work of historians, which are another kind of expert. You can't get away from experts; they're just everywhere. But at some point, it has to become the people's document. So I think we do need to do more than we have in trying to make it more accessible, more transparent. It's not also the most attractive document. You don't just sit down and say, well, I got some time here on Sunday afternoon, I'm going to just sit down and read the Constitution. You don't do that. It's a document that takes on meaning as you see how it's being put to use. To sit down and read it on Sunday afternoon would be comparable to sit down and reading the directions of a board game like Risk or Diplomacy. Now what you want to do is start playing it, and then you kind of have a dialectic between the game and the rules. That's how you begin to understand what the Constitution is, by seeing it in action, seeing it in historical instances. But I do think my main answer to your question would be that I think that originalism is a way of providing a different voice, and maybe trying for the Constitution's something closer to its original voice, allowing for the fact that we know it was a political document, and like all political documents, it's not univocal. All of that, and yes, there's some problem with it being the prisoner of constitutional lawyers, who are a very clever bunch and can prove, sort of like Thrasymachus in the Republic. They could prove anything if you give them half a chance.
Yeah. Well, part of the problem is that most of these court cases are about disputes, right? And so therefore you've lost the underlying, rationale for the fabric of the Constitution. So it's I suppose it's inevitable, but it is.
The Constitution is about, in part, it takes conflict as the sort of presumed state of things. I remember just a quick story. I was in Turkey, going around the country giving lectures on actually the separation of church and state as we practice in America. This was before, back like 2006. The Iraq War was going on, and the tensions between President Bush and the Congress were enormous at that time, and the Turkish reporters, who all tried to get me to talk about things I didn't want to talk about, said, well, what's happening? Is America falling apart? And I said, no, this is the way our Constitution is designed to work, so that vetoes and attempts to override vetoes, this is part of what we do. This is the system's working. It's ugly, it's unpleasant, but that's exactly what it's designed to do. And they found this incomprehensible.
I can imagine. No, the other part of this is that, and I'm borrowing this from my former graduate school colleague and friend, Jeff Toulis, who teaches at UT Austin.
Yes.
He's spent a lot of time just noting that it used to be rather common for congressmen and senators, and of course presidents, to speak about the Constitution. So, in other words, they had their own views about what the Constitution meant. It wasn't just the courts, it wasn't just the lawyers, and somehow we've lost that. Even, we occasionally get into this when we have a dispute about war powers or something else, then people pull out their copy of the Federalist Papers. But it used to be a more regular basis that senators in particular were very conscious of.
Yes. Not to be partisan, but the example that comes to my mind is the incident when Nancy Pelosi was asked whether, the Constitution gave Congress the power to pass essentially Obamacare, and she looked with genuine amazement, at the interrogator, and said, "Are you kidding?" So, the very notion that constitutionality was a hurdle that had to be surmounted was treated by her as a joke. And now I could speculate further about why she responded that way, but I don't think that would be profitable. But it's an example of the kind of reference that people don't make anymore to the authoritative nature of the Constitution. Whereas I mentioned the Clinton impeachments, just by the way, I remember distinctly how both sides were quoted. The Federalist Papers must have had a run on sales during the late 90s to match any time in its lifetime, because everybody was quoting from it. And what were high crimes and misdemeanors and all that. And it shows that we really can't do without that point of reference when we come into serious points of conflict. There were a whole series of these things in the Trump administration too, and many of which the administration lost because people who otherwise would not normally go to the Constitution for their armory did so successfully. I think we still, by and large, and I think this is resident in the bones of the American people, admittedly imprecise measure of civic education, but is that kind of veneration for the Constitution. They don't see it as merely a piece of paper. They don't see it as the Ark of the Covenant either. That's, I think, wrong. But I think there's Bill Kristol mentioned in the intro about how we've kind of acquired a renewed respect for the founders in the last 50 years. And I think that's true. And part of what we've appreciated is how extraordinary what they did was. And there's no other example of it. And we're the oldest Constitution. So these seems to me to be wonders, not merely acts of genius, but things of really quite wondrous capacity, and that we ought to be more reverent towards.
Yeah. Not
in a blind way, not in an obsequious way, but
I think you've pointed out in the past, when it's an odd phenomenon when it's very hard in most history departments. They get a course on great statesmanship, whereas the American public buys histories of Adams and Washington and the others. They snap those up, and those are Christmas presents. They're not the other volumes. Those are the Christmas presents.
Yeah, and you would think too that statesmanship would be. I mean, statesmanship actually goes, I think, beyond questions of constitutionality. I mean, that really is a whole subject unto itself. That the assessing of a total political situation in which the Constitution is an important element, but not the only element.
If you don't mind, before I turn to, we've got some questions coming in, but I did want to ask one other question. And let me preface this by a little story. About a decade ago, I was in a small conference having to do with civic education, and there was the usual discussion back and forth. This is mostly about civic education in high schools, and so there was the dispute between those. Well, we need to teach them more, about the civic foundations, the Constitution, and other things like that. And then there were those who were, saying, no, the only way to get students really to be committed to your civic order is through active participation. So that debate. And at some point, this went back and forth, and I, raised my hand and I said, I've heard of this debate, and it's a good one. It's not the case that I think that either of these points of view aren't worth considering and thinking about. But I said, what about attachment? Wasn't civic education supposed to be something about attachment? And I bring this up because your line about civic education should be an education of love. But of course, the difficulty is that when you live in a liberal society, raising the issue of how to manage civic education in such a way as that it also provides an attachment is no small obstacle.
It's no small obstacle, but I think there's something that people on the left don't seem to understand. They did for a little while at the time of Todd Gitlin wrote a book about the intellectuals in the flag that I thought showed some an awareness of this, but by and large, the left doesn't seem to realize if you want to have an expansive, active state doing lots of good things for people. It's not just a matter of ramming a $3.5 trillion piece of legislation through Congress. You need to develop in the citizenry a sense that they're part of a nation full of people they will never meet, people whose moral worthiness they'll never be in a position to judge, but yet for whose welfare they will need to give and give and give out of their own substance, out of their own treasure. To do so willingly, to do so gladly, requires a kind of civic education that involves love of the country, involves love of the nation as a whole, love for the people you disagree with, not wanting to see them vanished or canceled or vaporized. It's not a view of America that this would be a great nation if we could just get rid of the other half of it. And I particularly pick on the left with this because it does seem to me that they're the ones who want an expansive government and make good arguments for it. But the sentiment, there has to be a sentiment, broadly based sentiment behind that this is not just a matter of using the word contribution instead of taxes or that kind of gambit, but it has to be something that goes deeper than that. And to treat with contempt the patriotic sentiments of so many other Americans. It's a big mistake if what you want to do is what the left wants to do. It's a big mistake, and they've been making it over and over and over again.
So let me turn to a couple of questions from our viewers. Sorry, I'm almost blind, so I have to lean in. So this is from Paul Taylor. Professor McClay, you mentioned that civic education should be based on love. And to my mind, it's difficult to love something, an institution, a person, or anything else if you don't see an element of hope in it, even if not in the moment. It seems like many school administrators are hawking narratives of systematic hopelessness today. Can you say a bit more about the role of hope in civic education and how to convey it?
Oh, that's a great question. And I wrote a book with the title Land of Hope as a way of saying this is what we have been. I mean, you don't have to invent this. This is what we have been, and this is the reason that so much of the rest of the world is still beating down our door to get in. So I think, yes, it's hard to explain the perversity of so much of what passes for civic education now in the schools. But I think there are plenty of reasons for hope, and many of them are in our past. The version of the past that my colleagues in the historical profession and others have increasingly fashioned is blind to those elements. It's a blind anti-patriotism. We've come to see the term patriotism as a toxic word. I see it all the time. It's regarded, people hear you talk about patriotism and they think you mean some kind of aggressive, ethnocentric, whatever, something entirely negative or entirely illiberal. That wasn't the way Franklin Roosevelt talked about patriotism. There's really, again, the left, for reasons I can't really completely comprehend, has abandoned the idea that affection, attachment, as Mr. Taylor in his question talks about this, that I was trying to get at this at the end of my remarks, talking about the epidemic of not just suicide, but alcoholism, opioid addiction, so on and so forth, that many reasons can be adduced for those things. But I think having a sense for young people, having a sense that there is no future, that's a powerful thing. That's a powerful effect of education that is extremely negative. And it's wrong. It's wrong as a moral consideration, but it's wrong just factually. There in so many ways, we are so much better off than any society has been in all of human history in material terms. Some of our liberties, I think, are endangered, but that's the nature of liberty. Liberty is always endangered. We always have to resist the efforts to foreclose our liberties. That's just part of life. But I think I'm very hopeful about what most people want for their children, assuming they have children, assuming they have enough hope in the future to have them. And they don't want, and this is why we've seen these rebellions, the Loudoun County one near you, maybe one of the most famous in the country, but it's all over the place. It's here in Michigan and Ohio and this region where I am. People are really up in arms about the notion that their children are being poisoned in their view of the country, and that has an effect on their sense of their prospects in life. There's a way in which the character of the regime and the character of the regime as we understand it has a reciprocal effect on the soul. I mean, this is one of the most ancient teachings of political philosophy. And I think we're seeing it borne out, of course, in our own time. So you present people with a more accurate view of the regime, that it is flawed, it has done terrible things or allowed terrible things to happen without having the strength and resolve to do anything about them. But it is also ours. We are implicit and complicit in it with our very being. So we can't walk away from it. We can't not love it because we do damage to ourselves, to our own souls. If we,
it's always interesting when you go to the war memorials at Gettysburg or other war memorials, World War I and the like. or World War II, and you see the names, and the names aren't English typically. I mean, there are English names, English sounding names, but there's Italians, there's Germans and Poles,
Irish,
and those people, and Irish, and those people, almost certainly are only one generation away from being in another country, but there they are on the list of people who died for this country.
And of course, Lincoln was wonderful on this subject, and as on so many things, about how immigrants can have a stake too, even if they don't have a stake in the history, the blow by blow history of what the generation of 76 did. They can appropriate it in some way by coming and by adopting the Declaration.
So another question: what does constructive criticism of the Constitution of our past look like? How do we strike the balance between being honest and being destructive?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be evasive. I might want to know a little bit more about like what is it that we're criticizing? Are we talking about things like the 3/5 rule? Are they things that ways in which the Constitution accommodated slavery? That might be a good place to. I hope this is.
Yeah, no, that's good.
I hope this directs to the questioner's question. There's a very impressive book by the historian Sean Wilentz from Princeton called "No Property in Man," which I recommend to everyone. It's beautifully written, enormously complicated subject because more than half of the 55 individuals involved in the Constitution were slaveholders, more than half. So, and we there are provisions, fugitive slave provisions. There are ways in which the protection of slavery is incorporated in the Constitution. But what Wilentz insists on, and he is a man of the left, he's not going to try to let America off the hook, but he's also an honest historian. And his view, which I think he substantiates, is that Madison went to great lengths to make sure that the word slavery is never used in the Constitution because he did not want the possibility of that being employed at some later time as a way of enshrining property in man as an element in the Constitution. There were a lot of views, of course, at the time that people who thought that Sherman and others who thought that, well, the Constitution, the slavery was going to die out. It never got much established in New England, although people forget that at the time of the founding, it was everywhere, every single state. That New England very quickly got out of the slavery business, and because it didn't have an economic need for it. But there was a bit of complacency that, well, we don't need to deal with this now because this is an institution that doesn't have a future. And thanks to Eli Whitney and a few others, it did have a future that no one suspected it would have. Or I wouldn't say no one, but there were those who took that view. So the Constitution is a political document. It hedged on this issue. It set a date after which the slave trade could be abolished. It did a number of things that hint at the impermanence of its commitment to slavery, but it does protect the institution. That's a charge that I think can't be evaded. So there you go. I mean, that's an example of how I think you can engage in constructive criticism and also say, what is it? Where do we come down on this? Do we come down to the Constitution was a flawed document, which we were later able to improve and adapt, because that's what human beings are. We don't create perfect things. And anything we create may be perfect when we create it, but circumstances change and we need to adapt to them. Or do we say, like William Lloyd Garrison said, that the Constitution was a pact with the devil, and should be rejected entirely as no moral authority? I think in this case, Frederick Douglass's example is really, really interesting, because he moves from being a Garrisonian to being a Lincolnian, in a sense, in adopting a gradualist view of, and that the Constitution itself was a freedom-oriented document and not a slavery document. And I'm not saying because Frederick Douglass says it that's closest to the matter, but it is he went through an impressive process of changing his mind, but part of what Walter said that in the intro about an element of our patriotism is self-criticism. I loved that. We have to be willing to ask the questions. This is why even the 1619 people are not wrong to raise the issue the way the New York Times did it, and the notion of putting all this out to school children, that's deeply wrong. But we should be able to ask the question, do our continuing racial problems reflect some profound defect, our DNA or whatever, at the time of the founding, or at the time of the settlement of North America? 1619 goes way back, before that, before the Pilgrims, in Plymouth. W.E.B. Du Bois said, before your Pilgrims, we were here. And that's what he's referring to. And I think we could have observed 1619, the 400th anniversary of 1619, so much better than what the New York Times unleashed upon us.
Yeah. Well, if you don't mind, I'd like to end with, I think, a story that, I first heard it from Walter Berns himself, but I think it ties a few things together. Walter would tell the story about, at the time of the bicentennial of the Constitution, that he'd been asked to give speeches around the country, but also abroad. And he happened to be giving a talk in a Latin American country, which will remain nameless, but the point will be the same. He finished his talk, and the first question was by a gentleman who clearly was very angry and agitated and speaking in Spanish. So Walter didn't really know what he was exactly saying. But it turned out the agitation wasn't aimed so much at Walter, it was aimed at the sponsors of the talk, because the gentleman said, "Why are we listening to this American when they've only had one constitution when we've had many?" So,
yes.
So yes. I just want to say, Bill, thank you for reminding us of this, the civic centrality of this wonderful document that even has outlived our good Queen Elizabeth. So.
Yes, that's a wonderful, I just have to add to this, that it's sort of like saying that Elizabeth Taylor knew more about marriage than Queen Elizabeth, who just lost her husband, who was married to him for 70 years, whatever. Yeah. No, having one, I'm happy to say I've only had one, and I only will have one. You know more from that than from having many.
Yeah. No, thank you, Bill. This has been wonderful. Really appreciate it. Thank you,
Gary. Thank you to Yuval and Nicole and everyone there.
Yeah. You're welcome at AEI anytime.
Oh, thank you.
And we're clear.